Hey everyone, Thomas Riley here from Medieval Review, and I have the great pleasure to be sitting here with Matt Easton from Schola Gladiatoria. We are at Longpoint, so one of the, probably the biggest HEMA convention, tournament, whatever you want to call it. They say tournament, it's really a convention. It's a meeting of all people of like interests. It's the largest in the US, and certainly when suddenly you have two YouTubers sitting down in the same general space, videos are going to happen. So I'll be honest, I watch a lot of your videos. I really enjoy your insight, but there's one aspect I've never come across, and that is how you really got into this. As I think everyone who has an interest in history, in swords, in fighting, in whatever it may be, there's a story behind how you became that, and not, someone who's a doctor or, living in the modern world as it is sometimes. So I'm just kind of curious.
So I guess to an extent the story about how I got into HEMA is slightly different to how I got into being a YouTuber. And I laughed because I still find it very strange to be referred to as a YouTuber. I don't think of myself as a YouTuber. I just think of someone, who does HEMA and makes some videos. But how I got into HEMA, essentially I just was obsessed with history and warfare and weapons since as early as I can remember, growing up watching movies like Ben-Hur and, things about Crusaders and Henry V and all of this, Robin Hood, all the Robin Hood films, everything like that. And so I grew up especially obsessed with the medieval period. And as I kind of went through school, I studied as much medieval history as I could. I studied it at what we call A-level, which is the exams we do when we're 18, so 17, 18. I studied medieval history, and then I went on to do medieval history and archaeology at university as well, so that's what my degree is in. But during that whole period, as well as studying it, I was also, playing with the weapons side of it as well. So I started archery when I was 11. I started modern fencing when I was 15, 16, if I remember correctly, at school. I was very lucky because they didn't do it at my school, but it just so happened that when I was that age, about 15, 16, they brought in a fencing instructor only for about 2 years. So, but that gave me an introduction to modern fencing, foil fencing. And I dabbled a bit in reenactment as well. I think I went to maybe like 2 LARP events. I did all of those all of the things I could.
Whatever was there.
Yeah, just trying to absorb. When I was 16, I got a Saturday job in a cafe. I worked there for 5 weeks and then quit because it was horrible. But that gave me enough money to buy my first sword. And around the same time, I started collecting antique bayonets as well. Okay. I wanted to collect antique swords, but I couldn't afford them at that age, so I started with bayonets because they got fairly large blades, and that was as close as I could get to antique swords on the money I had. So I was just completely, absorbed and obsessed with all of this stuff and trying to learn as much as I could. I also did sort of work experience in antique shops and stuff like that that sold antique swords and stuff. So, and just, reading as much as I could, buying every time I've found a bookshop with old, second-hand books, pouring through it, finding anything on arms and armour or history of warfare that I could and buying it. And I was just completely obsessed with it, really. When I went to university, it was all about, for me personally, it was all about the 14th and 15th centuries. So I was totally absorbed by the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses. And the Condottieri Wars in Italy and everything else, and I think we spoke previously about aesthetics, and for me it was very much the aesthetic. I liked the weapons of that specific period. I liked the armour. I think it's a very fascinating period for the development of armour. Because you're going from predominantly mail to predominantly plate over that period, and the development of that plate. And actually, I wrote my degree dissertation on the development of the coated plates in the 13th and 14th centuries. So I managed to sort of wrangle my degree round even to point at armour as well. And while I was at university, I was doing kung fu. I did kung fu for about a year and a half, 2 years. And every now and again, as you do, you buy a martial arts magazine and read through it. And this one time, there was an article in, I think it was Martial Arts Illustrated, about a gentleman by the name of Terry Brown who was teaching English martial arts. And I was like,
what is that? That exists?
This exists, yeah. And it showed pictures of him with a backsword and a quarterstaff and I think a threshold. And this like blew my mind. So I, pretty much straight away got in contact with him and started training with him. And I trained with Terry for about 2 years regularly. I had a break. I had a break for a few months in the middle, but more or less I was training with him every week for a couple of years. And off the back of that, during that period, HEMA had just appeared on the internet. So back in those days, it was the Hacker Forum. What Hacker later became Armour, and then that kind of tore apart, and all of the lots of other groups spawned out of that. But in Europe, there were a few clubs. For example, the Dawn Duelists got together, I think, in the mid-90s originally. And I was at university from 1995 to 2000, so it was in that exact period when HEMA was suddenly kind of being reborn that I was at university, and I'd just discovered that it existed. So I was, right time, right place, right age, and highly, obsessed and motivated by it. And so, so after a couple of years with Terry, I wanted to branch out into looking at earlier sources because, as I said, I was obsessed with the 14th and 15th centuries, so I wanted to look at 14th and 15th century sources. I had an Italian friend who just coincidentally and very luckily for me was a fluent English-speaking Italian who was also specialised in medieval linguistics and literature, and one of my best friends at the time. So we got together and started working on the translation of Fiore's treatise, and I believe we were the first people to make available, at least online, portions of it, translation of Fiore's, the Getty version of Fiore's treatise. Initially, I'd actually wanted to study German sources for various reasons, partly because at that point I was more interested in the mid-15th century than the early 15th century. Partly because I am a tiny bit German, although I'm mostly English. I'm like 1/16 or something German, and I'm not at all Italian. But on the other hand, I've as just a matter of fate, I've spent a lot of my life going on holiday to Italy, so I actually know Italy quite well, and I've always had quite a lot of Italian friends. So it kind of pulled me in the Italian direction. So,
like you said, matter of fate, because everything you just said sounded like you were fated to be like in this sphere of interest, right? Because for me, my interest in the Middle Ages would kind of come and go because of movies, books, whatever. But it wasn't until I was in the United States high school that I read Timeline by Michael Crichton, and that was like, now I want to do this, because in that book is a character who, that's what he does. He fought with a sword, and he did archery, and I was like, people do that? And I went through the same thing. I found Haka, and so it's kind of funny. It's odd how that seems to work, but it sounds like you were well, you know what they say, you win the lottery if you were born English, but
I don't know if that's true these days with our current exchange rate.
But you're in the right place, and it's funny, you have a little bit of German in you, but you're not doing German. I've got Italian blood in me, but I don't do as much Italian. So there you go. But you've got those things that just are going to draw it to you. I think it's pretty interesting.
I mean, I have to say, if there were medieval English sources, I would have studied those, because I was really, really interested in the 100 Years' War. At the time, I had a French girlfriend as well, so I spent a lot of time in Aquitaine, around Bordeaux and that region, actually seeing the places that were related to the history I was obsessed with. So I mean, if I could have studied, if not English, then French, I would have done. But as you know, if you're looking at the 15th century, you've got to choose between German sources or Italian sources, and really Italian. There's Fiore and Vardi, and that's it.
I think the English were a little bit too busy fighting wars to write down how they fought wars.
It's one of those it's one of those great mysteries why there aren't treatises from other areas, and I think it's a very I think there's a complex series of social conditions that led to the production of treatises, because obviously most people had a master to student relationship with no need for a book. You don't need, if you that's your teacher and you go and study with your teacher 2 or 3 times a week, why would you need a book about it, So,
and I think it's worth noting, it's a huge gift to us, again, fated or whatever, that we have treaties like that, because you look at what was written in the Middle Ages, it's either going to be religious texts or political notations.
Or ancient histories in some
ancient,
cases.
yeah, you might have some callbacks, their own versions of histories, and other than that, you might have personal letters or whatnot. But the fact that someone took time to pen that down, I mean, you look at, you won't find a source on how to do, like, here's the treatise of how to do medieval carpentry, medieval blacksmithing. We know how. There are some indicators, but there's not like a book on it. But yeah, we have these fight books, really.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it is interesting that this period of time brings about the birth of treatises on subjects, how to do. And, I find it amusing that one of the earliest English treatises on anything is on fishing, is on angling. And so, I don't know how many people know, but the term angling comes from the fact that you use a line and a stick that forms an angle. So
I learned something new
That's
today.
where angling comes from, because you make an angle with a line and a stick. And this was I believe, a relatively new invention in the 15th, 16th century. And so they went, well, there's this new cool thing, this new way of, fishing. And so we'll write treatises about it.
Yeah.
But then, in England, the first weapon use treatise is on the use of the longbow, is Roger Ascham's Toxophily from 1545. And that predates the earliest English language fencing treatise by 50 years, I mean, that tells you a lot about English military history, because of course the longbow was the most important weapon
and the people
England.
they needed to train up for that. There wasn't necessarily going to be that master to student relationship built or established nearly as well as some other fighting arts.
Well, it's interesting because when Roger Ascham wrote that in 1545, archery was dying. And so what it was it's a bit like there are books about chivalry in the 15th century, because chivalry had already really died by the 15th century. So they're writing about it in a nostalgic sense. And it's the same thing with Toxophily, written in 1545, is that it's trying to keep alive the old traditions. How do you choose a longbow? What makes a good longbow? The different ways of shooting longbows in different conditions, the arrows, all that kind of stuff, because this was seen as a dying thing. Because of course firearms were starting to become prevalent by 1545. I mean, it's the year that the Mary Rose sank, and the Mary Rose had lots of longbowmen on it. So the longbow was still a military weapon, but people, I think, could smell the decline, that because the Mary Rose also had lots of cannons on it, which probably led to it sinking, incidentally, because they probably put too many guns on it to face the French, and they think it keeled over. But yeah, it's interesting. You often, and that raises a question. If you go, okay, well, sometimes you get treatises about a subject that's either really new or something that's dying and people want to keep alive. How might that relate to the fencing treatises we look at? It's interesting. I mean, not everybody agrees with me on this. In fact, I'll go even further. A lot of people disagree with me on this. But one of the assertions that I've made in the past is that the longsword, in reference to most people, the longsword was a relatively new weapon at the end of the 14th century. The longsword only really became popular around 1360, 1370, at the same time that full plate harness kind of reached its completion. And I think that it's not a coincidence that we get treatises about the use of the longsword coming about at the same time that the longsword starts to be a popular weapon. And I've often wondered, why aren't there more treatises about the sword and buckler at that time, which we know is very popular. And I think one of the possible answers might be that sword and buckler was widely known and understood.
It was an established thing.
And it was the common people's weapon, certainly in England and France. Sword and buckler fencing was something that was done for fun on feast days with a stick and a buckler. People would just do it. They They didn't necessarily study under someone. They just learnt when they were a kid how to use it, and they did it for fun and for sport.
I mean, the modern
So-
analogy would be like a car, right?
Yeah.
Most people know how to drive a car. You don't need to go read the manual. But
Yeah.
if someone goes and invents jetpacks,
Yeah.
we're all going to need manuals to tell us how to actually operate the thing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of the same.
Yeah.
That's
And it's
that's
not to say
interesting.
that, because the famous quote about the fact that Lichtenau didn't invent the art, that it's a very old art, but he sort of perfected it and codified it. I have a broader interpretation of that piece of text, in that I think that they're talking about fencing in general.
Yeah.
And I think whoever wrote that piece of text is saying fencing has existed since, for as long as swords have existed, or so as long as weapons have existed. But I do think that the use of the longsword, which is, related to other styles of fencing, but is distinct and is different to sword and buckler, or mesa, or sword and shield, or spear, or whatever. I do think that the ways of using longswords was a relatively new thing at the end of the 14th century. I mean, you only need to look at medieval manuscripts, and you look at ones from 1340, and everyone's using sword and shield. You look at ones from 1440, and lots of people have got longswords, and hardly anybody's got shields. There was a change in that 100 years. So yeah,
That's fascinating. All right, now I know I could talk to you for like the rest of this weekend, and I know we don't really have time for that, so I'll probably go ahead and regrettably cut this video short here. I really don't want to do that. So, Matt, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me,
No, it's a
and
pleasure.
I'm actually really looking forward to the classes you're going to teach here.
cool. Which are not medieval. They're
No,
now,
but that's actually-
because I now focus on
right.
19th century stuff.
And that's
mostly,
actually
so-
why I'm so excited for it, because you're gonna be teaching me something I can't really go teach myself as easily.
Cool.
So I'm really looking forward to these topics. There's so many good topics being covered. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you again, Matt.
Thank you. Cheers.
Certainly, I will link to everybody knows Matt's site, but I'll link to it, Schola Gladiatoria. Thank you again, and everyone else, have a wonderful day.